This is Glenn Robinson, President of the World Affairs Council of the Monterey Bay Area. I would like to welcome you to our newest edition of Quick Takes on International Affairs. Please enjoy this talk and do consider joining the World Affairs Council.
Hello, I'm Professor Tsypkin. I teach at the Department of National Security Affairs of the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. I'm a specialist in Russian politics and security, and I will talk today about how democracy has failed in Russia. I would also like to note that I'm expressing just my own views, not the views of the Department of the Navy or any other agency of the United States government. Well, what is a democracy? We generally know what it is. It's a government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation, usually involving periodically held free elections. That's pretty simple definition. Democracy, in order for democracy to exist, certain conditions are necessary. Individuals should have equal rights under law. There should be freedom of speech. The government should be accountable and transparent. People should enjoy freedom of assembly. Civil society should be strong. There should be religious freedom. These are definitions of the United States non-governmental organization, Freedom House. Now, all of these conditions existed to various degrees during the 1990s in Russia, during the reign of the first democratically elected president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. Government was not transparent, but for example, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and religious freedom were quite strong. But although the guarantees of equal rights and accountability and transparency of government and existence of civil society, these were not the factors characteristic of Russian political system in the 1990s. But all of these conditions necessary for existence of democracy have been systematically destroyed by the regime of Vladimir Putin, who has been in power now since the year 2000. Actually just rewritten the constitution to allow himself to stay in power until 2036. Now, why did things go so wrong for Russia? We had these high expectations that Russia now will be a democracy and a partner to the United States. What and how went wrong? Russia faced enormously difficult tasks in the 1990s. It had to overcome its imperial legacy. After all, what today is Russian Federation was just one of the republics of the USSR, which was run from Moscow by Russians. Suddenly, Russians lost all their imperial periphery. Ukraine was gone, the three Baltic states were gone, Central Asian states were gone, Georgia, Armenia, and so on and so forth. So Russians had somehow to deal with it. It had psychological problems, military problems, and economic problems resulting from disintegration of the empire. Russia also had to move from the command economy, to market economy. Command economy was very different. Everything was determined by the plan. Money did not play an important role. Prices did not play an important role. They had to move to market economy. And moreover, they had to move from a one-party political system to a multi-party democratic one. And all of that had to be done quickly under the conditions of collapsing economy. Russia also lacked any recent memory of civil society, of independent judiciary. In the communist system, judiciary was just branch of the Communist Party, and no tradition of political parties representing interests of various sectors of the public. Add to this that Russia in the 1990s did not have a middle class. Middle class is a foundation of democracy. Instead, Russia had a very few rich individuals who got, who made money out of the collapsing economy and nascent market economy very quickly, and the majority of the people who were impoverished by hyperinflation and disoriented. Hyperinflation, there was a terrible inflation. I remember that going to Moscow in those days, I went there on business. Every time I had to, just if I would exchange, $20, and that would be a bag of Russian rubles. This was devastating. Again, I remember my arrival in Moscow in 1992 after absence of 15 years. And it was like coming to the capital of a country which had just been defeated in a war. Boarded up houses in the center of the city, rusted cars, roads which were really impassable. It was dangerous. At night, you wouldn't see people on the street, which is unusual for Moscow. Russians generally like to get out on the street and walk around and, enjoy themselves. But people were hiding because crime was rampant. Police, instead of protecting the citizens, joined the criminals. The state was weak. It was a state that did not collect taxes, or at least didn't collect enough taxes, but also did not provide services, often did not pay old age pensions. People would go without, without their pensions. The government did not, the financial support to educational system, to healthcare system collapsed. Then, of course, Russia had a complex ethnic structure. About 20% of the population of Russian Federation are not ethnic Russians. There are other ethnic groups that live in their homelands and do not necessarily see Moscow as a legitimate authority. One of the manifestations of that were two wars in the 1990s in the North Caucasus between Russian forces, Russian military, and the Chechens, the mountain people, the people who live in the mountains of North Caucasus, Muslims, and they wanted to become independent of Russia. Russia actually lost the first war in 1990, between 1995 and 1996, humiliating loss of what had just been a superpower to a tiny nation of several hundred thousand. And then, of course, there was a growing corruption reaching all the way up into the Kremlin. Given that the mass media were reasonably free in the 1990s, the stories of corruption in the Kremlin became common knowledge. In this unstable and threatening situation, President Boris Yeltsin or rather his supporters, wrote a new constitution which turned the Russian Federation to what we can call a super presidential republic, where the executive branch had much more power than the legislative and judiciary ones. That's a complex story, which I don't have time to go into now. The new constitution was written by people who believed, with good reason, that Yeltsin was committed to democracy, that he would not abuse his power too much. But of course, you don't write constitutions just for one person. You have to write constitutions for decades and for different individuals. In 2000, Yeltsin could not run for president anymore because he had his 2 terms. He was also sick, and he was very, very unpopular because the whole experiment of democracy did not go down well in Russia. Terrible economic conditions. And he chose a successor. A whole operation, sort of political operation, was carried out to ensure that Vladimir Putin would be chosen as president. It was, it was a big spin operation. What do we know about what did Putin bring with him to the Kremlin? Well, he grew up in a tough neighborhood, and it was a kind of, the wrong side of the railroad track, where where you never ever allow somebody to push you around, or to you cannot look like you'll be pushed around. Then he served in the KGB, the Soviet secret police, where he learned the arts of spying, distrust, and building sort of networks of agents, and always looking for enemies of the state, or his personal enemies. In the 1990s, he spent first half of the 1990s in the corrupt politics of Russia's second most important city, St. Petersburg, where, according to persistent rumors, he began to enrich himself, got involved with a criminal crowd, and was sort of the liaison he was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and has the liaison of the mayor's office with, with the St. Petersburg mafia. He spent the next several years in Moscow working in the Kremlin, where he attracted attention of Putin's entourage, called the family, nicknamed the family, which supposedly involved his daughter, her husband, several other individuals close to Yeltsin, who was enfeebled in the second half of the 1990s. And they realized that Yeltsin would have to leave office, and they looked for a person who would protect them from prosecution for corruption, protect them against revenge, and so on and so forth. And Putin seemed to be it. The right guy, didn't have any powerful connections. They thought that he would be an obedient president, a puppet president. Then he was so he was a product of this internal machinations. He was also a product of spin doctors. In mid-1999, nobody heard, the Russian public hadn't heard about Putin. So spin doctors, he was the director of federal FSB, the security services, the KGB successor. And this is not a person who is very much in the public eye. So spin doctors who controlled Russian TV created Putin. He was a nothing, an unknown. And then next minute, he was appointed prime minister and very quickly became became popular. Obviously, all of this background has made him very cynical about democracy. And actually, at the onset of his rule in 2000, and he won election, hands down. I mean, it was quite obvious that his opponent would lose before the election took place. Simply because Putin, people who were advancing Putin, controlled television. His opponent was squeezed out of television commercials. At the very beginning, Putin actually made clear that Russia was not yet ready for Western democracy. He also said that his job was, first of all, to rebuild a strong state. In the traditional Russian understanding of strong states, a strong state meant executive branch dominating legislative and judiciary branches and civil society. And this is what he began doing. He also promised to limit the influence of the super rich Russians, oligarchs. That made him popular, and he indeed started cutting down to size the super rich and influential Russians who became very rich in the 1990s. Now, what he did not mention was also that he would make his friends, who mostly came from St. Petersburg, would make his friends into new oligarchs. He gave them lucrative government contracts, and for which they would thank Putin by supporting his causes, shoveling money over to whatever he wanted, and apparently making him very, very rich. He also didn't mention that he would subordinate the most important media to the Kremlin, especially television, later major newspapers. How did he do it? He didn't, these were owned by private interests, but he would allow friendly oligarchs to buy these new media outlets and control editorial policies. He also didn't say that he would give enormous powers to the Federal Security Service, FSB, the heir to the KGB, the organization which he would use together with police and judiciary against his political enemies. He would, if Putin or any of his friends doesn't like you, the police or FSB would find a case against you. Putin also was very lucky after the year 2000 because the oil prices went sharply up after 2000, and so did Russia's GDP. In the 2000s, Putin could buy popularity. Actually, standard of living, at least in big cities, improved quite dramatically. I was a witness to that. You just look, this is what happened to crude oil prices. This is 1990s. Unlucky Yeltsin. Oil prices, were falling. And this is what, Putin was lucky. Oil prices went up. And actually, once they started going down and never rose to the 2000 level, Putin started having political troubles. But you look at Russian gross domestic product. Look how it started growing together with oil prices. Russia mostly depends on exporting energy. The situation we ended up with is that the longer Putin stays in the Kremlin, the more he has to rely on security services. The more he relies on security services, the more corrupt they become, and they become corrupt at the expense of business owners. The result of that is that people with money don't want to invest in Russia, at least invest in anything that brings quick profits. With oil prices no longer sky high, the economy has stagnated. The more it's stagnating, the worse the environment for business is, the more tired the Russian middle class, which has grown especially after the year 2000, the more tired the Russian middle class, especially young people, become of Putin. The longer he stays in the Kremlin again, the more he has to lose if ousted from power. He's become very rich. And so he knows that if he loses power, he would lose his money, his palaces, and he would probably lose his freedom. So the more he becomes obsessed with threats to his rule, I don't want to use the word paranoid because it's a medical term, but he's obsessed to threats to his rule. He sees enemies everywhere. He's a very careful person, very cagey, but so far he's managed to survive for 20 years. It's nearly only Stalin has been a ruler of Soviet empire or a communist empire for longer than that. As I mentioned, Putin has changed the constitution to make himself in effect president for life. The more he relies on the security service and on suppressing the civil society, which has become rebellious in the last several years, the more he suppresses civil society, the more he manipulates elections to make sure that he can control the parliament. And the more he isolates Russia from the decadent Western democracies, the closer he brings Russia to an eventual another political collapse and an explosion. I also should say here that Russia is not the only one that has failed in a transition to democracy. The majority of countries that emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union are by no means democracies, or democracies are very weak there. They all share the burden of the past, communist past, and the difficulties of building democracy. And the last point I would like to make, that democracies are not easy to build, but they're easy to lose. Thank you very much, and have a good day.